right, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. This is our Thursday research seminar. My name is Harold Trinkutis. I think everybody knows that, but just in case for the folks watching remotely, I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. A real pleasure to welcome today's speaker, and I hope I don't too badly mangle her name, Dr. Dagmar Arichnowska. I practiced a little bit, is a Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow at the Technoscience and Societal Transformation Group at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna. She received her PhD from Charles University in Prague, an MA in Comparative and International Studies at the University of Zurich, and an LLM in Law and Politics of International Security at the University of Amsterdam. Her research is at the intersection of international relations, security studies, technology, and explores controversies in research and governance of innovation and a focus on bioweapons, biosecurity, and biobanks. She's here to talk to us today about some of her research. We're very glad to welcome you here.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and invitation, and it's a real pleasure to be here and talk with you about my research. So, as was just said, I'm a political scientist, and I look at security controversies in science and technology. And I think this is a specifically interesting topic because as a critical security researcher, I believe that security is a special type of politics, and by labeling something as a threat or a security risk, we actually enable to legitimize otherwise thinkable or unusual steps and measures. This has, of course, many serious implications. I think a nice example is these days the coronavirus measures that we see being introduced, and something that we would probably not think about even a few weeks or months ago. And I'm interested in how security politics plays out in the field of science and technology as symbol of something completely different, and that is a symbol of progress and betterment and advancement. So how do we bring together and reconcile this, on the one hand, interest in security, and on the other hand, the interest in progress and advancement? And the topic that I would like to talk about today, which I think is one of the examples of the fields in which this conversation is still to take place, is the field of biobanking. And sorry for that. So what are biobanks? Biobanks are research repositories for biological samples and associated data. And the idea of collecting such samples and data is not entirely new, but it has changed in nature in the past few years, approximately 20 years, and it has gained a new dynamic, especially with the advancement of other new technologies. So, for instance, 5 years ago, the US government launched an ambitious research program called All of Us, previously known as the Precision Medicine Initiative Cohort program, which aims to collect comprehensive medical and health data from over 1 million of participants. And this is the website to mobilize the participants, to motivate people to get involved in the program. And the goal of the program, to quote, is to accelerate health research and medical breakthroughs, enabling individualized prevention, treatment, and care, unquote. So this is a revolutionary public health program, one can say. And as a part of it, the US government also established a new biobank at the Mayo Clinic with the goal to collect and analyze biological samples from participants and make these samples and data available for further research. So as we can see, biobanking is very future-oriented technology. So far, biobanks focus mostly on collecting data, and research starts to take place using this kind of data, but the actual application is something for the future, something to come. So that's why also the narratives on what biobanking will do in the future are so important. So as I said, the idea of biobanks are not entirely new. Biobanks have been here for over 100 years. There have been many research repositories of biospecimen which collect data and samples to understand and improve the treatment of diseases. But with new technologies in the last few decades, we have seen significant advancements, and not only in terms of how many biobanks are being established, but also how the science of biobanking looks like and what it can do. So this is a look into one of the biobanks. So as you can see, there are large collections of biological samples stored in big freezers. But at the same time, these biological samples are accompanied by data, either data which are gained directly from participants, such as clinical data, family history, lifestyle data, such as sport habits or smoking behavior, but also data which are gained from sequencing, the gene sequencing from the biological samples that are gained as physical material from the participants. So biobanks include both this physical component as well as the data component, and the data component nowadays become more important. And this data is stored in large clouds, and the idea is to share data from these clouds between biobanks and then to researchers. So why do biobanks do that? Well, there are many envisioned applications of biobanking science. First of all, biobanking is supposed to serve to basic research and life sciences research, but most promises come from biobanking being used for the development of new drugs, pharmaceutical research, and perhaps most importantly, something that is called precision or personalized medicine. So biobanking is seen as a part of broader turn towards medicine, which should take individual more as a specific, segment of society, and not provide universal type of medical care, but really care which is targeted at the specific genetic features and specific needs of that patient. And in order to allow that, biobanks nowadays builds on two big trends, which is on the one hand, datification of health, and on the other hand, big data science. So datification of health is basically the trend towards collecting health data, building large databases of data regarding all sorts of things that we can measure and that we can store or somehow identify in an individual, and to use this data via using the big science tools, nowadays progressing towards the use of AI, towards data analytics, deep learning, and so forth and so forth. So there are many visions of what biobanking should accomplish in the future and how it should improve the healthcare in the future and make better treatments possible. But at the same time, if we look at the trends from which biobanking grows, we also can see that these trends have been already discussed, not only in the positive context, but also in the context of certain controversies and big political questions, which show that these trends are not only always beneficial to the society, but also bring new controversies and dilemmas. So If we look at trends in related fields using big data, we can see that there are many benefits with using and applying big data. The most important perhaps is the customization, so customization of products, services, of targeted advertisement and so forth, something that we make use of every day in terms of the services that we need when we want to find whether accommodation or a car or whatever else on the internet. The internet already knows who we are and what we need, so we are getting way more better services. So we are mostly happy for this. But at the same time, the same type of logic can be used for slightly different purposes. And this has been used among else in security governance, because the current security environment is more and more defined by uncertainty of the future and the inability to predict what concretely will be the next threat to come. And that's why security professionals more and more resort to data collection and analysis as a way to find certain suspicious patterns. For instance, when it comes to countering extremism, radicalization on the internet, and so forth. So there is a big use of big data analytics and surveillance in order to identify certain suspicious profiles of people and then focus on these more specifically. Another trend which we can see related to big data is the discriminatory treatment by both commercial companies, for instance, for pricing or insurance or accessibility of products and services in the first place. So you would be evaluated based on your data, and then you might get different treatment than someone else. But this is also being used by public authorities, for instance, for policing, surveillance, border management, or in some instances for the suppression of human rights. So there are many problems already, which we can see in related fields related to biobanking, and which have already been quite politicized and debated in our societies. So what I'm asking is, how do we learn from these, what lessons do we learn from these other fields to the field of biobanking, which is still, I would say, very much at the beginning of asking the bigger social and political questions. And when we look at the public discourse, we can see that biobanking is not a very politicized issue. It's not something that would be a subject of public concern. It's not something that people would talk about. It's not something that would be very much discussed in political arenas. At the same time, political and security controversies related to big data collection and research are not connected to biobanking. So as I have said, they are being discussed in different contexts, but not really in the context of biobanking. So how is this possible? How come that these bigger controversies are absent from the public political discourse on biobanking? Well, what I did in my research is to turn to the community of biobankers, and as I said, since it is a community which is still developing, the whole research is still developing, I came there to study how biobankers themselves think about what constitutes risks and threats of biobanking, and how do they anticipate broader political and security implications of biobanking. So how did I do that? I draw on security studies and science and technology studies, and specifically I use the concept of imaginaries, which are collective visions of the future, and specifically the visions of scientific and social order as mutually influencing, also called co-producing each other. And I bring this concept to the context of critical security studies, in which we study narratives of security and security frames. And I'm interested in how the biobanking community imagines insecurity, how they frame imaginaries of insecurity, which I understand as shared visions of security threats entangled with advances in science and technology. And specifically in these imaginaries, I focus on 4 elements. The first one is referent object. So who or what is seen as to be protected? What is the value to be protected? Second, the threat. So who or what constitutes a security threat to the referent object? Third, the technological component. So how technology plays a role in the materialization of the threat. And finally, measures. So what measures are adopted in order to tackle the threat? And concretely, I look at the biobanking community in Europe on the organization called BBMRI-ERIC, which is pan-European infrastructure funded directly by the European Commission, which seeks to bring together key actors in the field of biomedical research and biobanking in Europe, and works towards harmonizing and globalization of research by building an infrastructure for European biobanks. It was established in 2013, includes currently 20 countries and 1 international organization. And the BBMRI-ERIC directory has now over 100 million samples, which makes it the largest biobanking catalog on the globe. And as we can see, the motto of BBMRI-ERIC is making new treatments possible. So it is really about envisioning what biobanking will do in the future. Concretely, I proceeded, as I said, I'm focusing on BBMRI-ERIC, and I studied the imaginaries of insecurity within BBMRI-ERIC at several levels. First, I look at the key documents of BBMRI-ERIC, such as position papers, reports, secondary literature, which is written either on BBMRI-ERIC or by people from BBMRI-ERIC. Then I did interviews with LC experts, because LC team is one of 3 key pillars of the organization. So I talked with LC experts focusing on ethical, legal, and social implications of biobanking. And finally, I participated at 2 European Biobank Weeks, which is like the most important conference for biobankers in Europe, and which brings together the key players from biobanking field in Europe. And by studying all these materials, I analyzed the frames, the narratives of imaginaries of insecurity, and I also used insights from my ethnographic research. So what are my results, or the preliminary results? I identified 3 frames, 3 frames of insecurity imaginaries. The first one can be seen as security as firewall. And this frame actually draws on security as a symbol for data security. So when you talk with people, security in biobank is typically a synonym associated with data security. So on this understanding, what is to be protected are the data or samples, and the threat here is that someone will access these data or disrupt the flow of this data, and thus also disrupt the circulation of data as a way to make biobanking possible. This frame mostly draws on measures that are associated with IT, so technological measures, but also physical barriers and legal regulations are related to securing the whole infrastructure from some outsider accessing the data and intervening in the whole system. Interestingly, pretty much everyone agrees that the topic is important, that we should focus on it, but at the same time, it is seen only as a technical issue, not something that should be politicized, not something that should be discussed, and is pretty much outsourced or it's left to the specialists who take care of it. So for instance, I can quote one interviewee who told me, "Security is an issue because it is something that we need to take care of and is critical. It is important, but it is not a problem. It should not interfere with the progress of biobanking. We should take care of it if we did as we did years and years and years in the hospital." So again, illustration that this is something that we need to take care of technically, but it's not something that we should discuss how to do it in the broader biobanking community. The second frame is security as privacy. And here, the privacy concerns are linked not to data and their security, but the security of the individual who is behind the data. The privacy concerns are way more politicized in the biobanking community and have been in the field already from the beginning, because the concerns that data can be linked to the individual and that individual can be identified has been already in the biobanking field at the beginning. There was a very controversial Icelandic biobank case at the end of 1990s when a private company got a license from the Icelandic government to build population biobank in Iceland. But this biobank was not based on any informed consent, but it was based on presumed consent model. So it assumed that people want to be included, they wanted to be included in the biobank, and there were very limited options of withdrawal from the biobank. And this stirred a lot of controversy, and after several years of human rights activists and doctors and patients protesting against this, the law was changed and the biobank had to switch to the informed consent model, which eventually became the role model for biobanking community. So there has to be some contract between the data participant / patient and the biobank, which was not taken for granted at the very beginning. So in this frame, as I said, the privacy of the individual is seen as the key value, even though it's pretty vague. It's not very clear what the privacy means. And another problem is that the privacy of the participant is balanced with the public value of biobanking. Because if we want to maximize the privacy, the security of the individual, we would decrease the quality of the data by anonymizing the sample, but then this would decrease the quality of the data, and the data would be way more limited, which is not what researchers want. So there is this ongoing debate on how to balance the privacy of the individual and the public value of biobanking, which materializes in a debate on how to actually design the informed consent. And if narrow or broad consent model should be chosen, in which participant either more specifically agrees with what the data will be used for, or if it's more of an open consent, I'm giving you my data for research purposes, and I'm trusting the biobank that it will use it wisely, to put it simply. And this, as I said, it's quite politicized in the biobanking community, but at the same time, the debate is based on ethical and legal controversies. So it's very much seen as an ethical and legal issue. The third frame is very much minority frame, and I call it security as an elephant in the room. Because it draws on very unclear notion of some security concern, which the biobanking community should address, but it does not really address. And the notion of the threat here is some unintended secondary use of biobanking data by either state or private actors for other than research purposes. So here the concern is not only the security of the individual, but also security of the society or specific segments of the society. And when we dig slightly deeper into this very minor discourse, we can see that the risks that people talk about or write about are mostly associated with genetic profiling and related discriminatory behavior, either on behalf of private companies or the state, such as for rationing decisions for health resources or violation of human rights. And in general, we can say that a state biobank relationship is something that is not really, it's not really clear how this relationship should look like. Because in the past, there have been instances where the state asked biobank to provide data for other than research purposes. For instance, in Sweden, 2004, Swedish government changed the law temporarily in order to allow biobank data to be used for the identification of victims of tsunami. In other instance, biobank data was used for police investigation. So again, something that is not research purpose, and the state asked for this, and the biobank actually gave the data to the state. There were some other instances where the state wanted to access data for, I think, civil court decision, but it was denied. But we already see that there are cases in which the biobank data are attractive for the state for, as I said, other than research purposes. And this is something that some experts consider as problematic, but at the same time they point out that it is not an issue in the biobanking community. So I will quote again one of my interviewees, from whom I actually draw the name of the frame. Security is a bit like the elephant in the room. We are kind of not really addressing the issue. Maybe because we don't really know what the security issues might be in 5, 10, 20 years from now. Also, maybe because we probably do not want to acknowledge that there are security issues. So it is a way of reassuring ourselves that everything is fine. So if we compare these three frames together, we can see that there are different reference objects, data and samples on the one hand, individual on the other hand, and individual and society in the elephant in the room frame. The threat is also different. In the first case is the unauthorized access to data and samples or disrupting the data flow. In the second case is the disclosure of sensitive information. And in the third case, it's secondary unintended use of data. The technical component is not very clear in the third frame, but in the first one, it's typical like cyber security incident, so hacking, stealing, or manipulating data. And in the privacy frame, the technical component is insufficient data management, insufficient design of informed consent, and so forth. And the measures are typically a mix of technological, legal, and in the case of privacy, strongly ethical measures. In the third case, as I said, the discourse, the narrative is relatively vague, so this is not clear what the measures even might be, or it's not something that would be taken care of. So as we have seen, technical, ethical, and legal framings of insecurity prevail in the biobanking community. And at the same time, the political and security context is largely marginalized in the biobanking discourse. And as I said before, given the incidents in other fields, I think this is slightly surprising and striking. So I'm asking, how is this possible? And I come with two types of explanations or context for explanation. The first one is that there is a lack of evidence of concrete threat scenarios from the field. So there is no concrete history of something wrong happening. And the second is the broader culture of anticipating the future of biobanking. So if we look at how biobankers think about the future and future challenges, we see that the main issue for them is the sustainability of biobanking. This is the key theme. How to become financially sustainable and how to make the research sustainable. Because what is needed for the research is good quality of samples and data, and we need new samples, new data, so that new research, good quality research can be conducted, and so that this can bring the promised benefits to the society, which so far has been relatively very small. And in this discourse on sustainability, we see that a key currency, a key value is actually trust. Trust is seen as something that makes biobanking possible and sustainable. And the trust has actually three dimensions. First, biobanks need public trust, so they need the trust of the potential patients so that they can give them the high quality of data, so that they do not really problematize what biobanks do. Second, biobanks need trust from governments and overall political sphere. First, for securing funding, because biobanks are largely publicly funded. And second, so that there is, let's say, appropriate regulatory environment, which was highly visible, for instance, when the European General Data Protection Regulation was negotiated, and biobanks played quite a big role in lobbying for specific exceptions in the regulation. And finally, what is also needed is trust within the community, so that biobanks share data and research and build the culture of sharing data as something unproblematic, which is not, again, to be taken for granted. So even BBMRI-ERIC openly acknowledges that trust is and will continue to be a core pillar of biobanking. In that respect, trust should be fostered in order to provoke longevity. And another quote from my interviews: if we lose the trust of participants, we are also out of business. So to conclude, biobanking, as I have said, is a technology of the future. So it's important to look at how the future is envisioned, both the positive future and the negative future. And the narratives of what can go wrong with biobanking are at this point very much focused on the protection of data and privacy. And these concerns are then addressed via technical, legal, and practical measures, technical, legal, and ethical, practices, which are seen as a way to secure biobanking. However, I argue this type of anticipatory governance, this type of security governance is very limited, and it vitally narrows down the prospects of debating broader questions which we need to debate in biobanking regarding the broader, regarding the undesired futures of biobanking. And what is needed is really to bring the social and political context to the imaginaries of insecurity in biobanking. So if we look at the title of a recent article from Forbes, which says biobanking is changing the world, then I will argue we need to address the question of what kind of world we want to create with biobanking and what kind of world we do not want to create with biobanking. That's it. Thank you.
All right. thank you all. If we could hold photography, just because this will be posted online, so you will have access to it later on. We post all these videos on our YouTube channel. As per usual, I'll keep a list. First few questions to our fellows, I'll just go ahead and call on you. Please identify yourself and your affiliation when you speak. And 2 fingers to get on the question at hand. So far I'm seeing Maria and Lauren and Deepak and Jinru. Great. And I also see Megan in the back and Gabrielle. So let's proceed on that list. Oh, and Melissa. But I think I might make you number 7. Okay, the first 4 questions. You just got to be fast. It's a first rule you learn in Washington: put your hand up before you have formulated your question. Okay, Maria.
Hi, Maria Grimberg. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here. So I was wondering.
We're using the microphone today.
Okay. Sure. Why not? Apologies if it sounds weird. So my question is this. Most groups that, or companies, I guess, that have to do with technology, especially technology that touches on some aspect of biological data, usually have protest groups associated with them. And I was wondering, well, I suppose, do these such protest groups exist? But more importantly, do they share the same frames of security as the company members themselves?
Just one at a time.
Thank you for the question. A very, very interesting way how to approach the topic. I think it's important to distinguish between the, the private and public spheres here, because there are many initiatives in the private sphere, especially among the big tech, Apple, Google, and so forth, which nowadays engage in the health data collection and analysis. And this, of course, is met with a lot of protests regarding the privacy and what is actually being done with the data. But the biobanking sphere is publicly funded, and it's seen actually as a public value. So there is not really a protest against it. This also, I would say, is because biobanks, as I mentioned in my presentation before, are not really politicized. It's not something that most people would know about. When I typically tell my colleagues, friends, what I study, they say, well, I've never heard of biobanks. Well, most of the people do not really know biobanks. So it's not really a politicized issue, and it's not something that would be seen as problematic and worth being protests. It's really seen as beneficial. If it's discussed at all, it's seen as beneficial part of new way of doing research.
Just a quick 2-finger clarification on that. Is that just in Europe, or do you think that's true more globally? Because I think I get the impression biobanking type things in the United States might actually be in the private sector. So, for example, would 23andMe be an example of a biobank?
Yeah. I wouldn't call it concretely a biobank. This is, as I said, the private sphere, which does different things, and there are protests against them. There are a lot of suspicions because the contract between the data participant and the biobank or the company is very vague. It basically gives all the power to the company. But this is a different story, which I think makes it more interesting and also makes it a public concern, because it's seen as a public good, public value. So I think the governance of biobanks should also be seen as a public concern.
Lauren?
So my name is Lauren Borja. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. So my question was, how do future threats get incorporated into some of these? Because I guess I was thinking of, say, the case of like Henrietta Lacks, who gave her cells and then later her DNA, even though she didn't necessarily consent to that. Like, how is that different when security is then applied after consent is given or wasn't even asked for at all? and like what new things might become a threat. You know, like obviously that's a threat when the technology is able to actually sequence all the DNA and like, you know, but you could also spin it a different way in terms of like future technology not being able to deal with like COVID-19, as a person who's also here because their conference was canceled due to that virus.
May I ask you, what do you mean when you say what is different when security is brought in?
That's
okay,
not
that's
fair.
Kind of my
you can't
question.
ask me questions. No. Yeah, I was trying to think of it as a way. So I'm a scientist, so I tend to frame things as like, what happens when technology advances, which I realize is a very guiding question. So I don't really know what I was thinking, if that helps. But yeah, so you wanted me to clarify when security is brought in. So when a threat becomes more concrete and you have to deal with that, is that something that has been anticipated, or how would the frames need to shift to incorporate that, perhaps? Is that better? Or yeah.
Am I allowed to have a two-finger question in anticipation of, just because Lauren's question might be an analogy maybe, and I don't know if this is what you're thinking about, is a big criticism of like sort of Internet of Things, for example, or cybersecurity, is that the engineers who design these systems don't take security into account at all, and then you're having to patch security onto things later. Is that sort of in the same?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. Well, as I try to show, security, perhaps in the like national security sense of meaning, is not really part of the narrative. It's not in the imaginary at all, and it's probably partly because there have not been any incidents which would really bring this to the agenda, but partly because people not really want to think about it as a concern, because it would make the whole business way more complicated. So that's why I think most of the issues are really seen as part of the data security and data privacy part of the story. So how do we make sure that the whole system, that the whole infrastructure is protected against some external threat, whatever the external threat is, right? Typically with the vision of some cyber hacker in mind. But this is not something that is explicitly discussed, maybe a little bit in some specific IT reports, but it's not really part of the narrative. So I would say the focus is much more on measures. So what do we do, rather than on discussing what is the threat, if you see what I mean. The focus is on more bureaucratic type of security. We want to have things right. We need to act lawfully. We need to have all these consent. We need to have all these IT measures. But there is not really explicit debate on why is it there, against what type of threat it is there.
Thanks. Deepak?
I will try not to scream into this. I'm Debak Das. I'm a pre-doctoral fellow over here at CSAC. So it seemed to me, this is a very interesting presentation. Thank you so much. So it seemed to me that BBMRI-ERIC is largely self-regulated in some ways. And so I'm wondering what the governance, or like the state or IO lawmaking or regulatory entity here is, and assuming that they are a separate entity than BBMRI-ERIC, what are the regulatory ethics driving that form of governance or lawmaking, and what is their imagined future in some way a different one than the one that the practitioners have?
Interesting. Thank you. I would not say that BBMRI-ERIC is largely self-regulated. It's really, there are many international regulations on how biobanks should look like and how biobank data should be handled. And especially, well, in Europe, not especially, but in Europe, really a major theme nowadays is the GDPR, so the Data Protection Regulation, which has brought a whole new agenda to the field of biobanking, and they have dealt with how to apply GDPR to practice, basically since 2018, when the regulation came into force. So I would say they are not self-regulated, but they try to translate the general regulations, the law, to the language of the biobanking and to make it accessible to biobanks. Because biobanks are often relatively small organizations, maybe part of hospitals and so forth. So they rely a lot on the guidelines that come from the higher sphere, which is in this case the BBMRI-ERIC.
Two-finger debug?
Yeah, just to follow up. So I wanted to know if the GDPR, if the GDPR is a law, what is the entity which legislated on that, and what is the imagined future envisaged within the framework of that law? And so the question really is that then different than the one that BBMRI has? So is there tension between those two? So,
can I do just a quick two-finger? So I really quickly did a Google search, and I saw that the World Health Organization has kind of a sub-entity called the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is it's in the top 10 largest biobanks in the world. So I would just be interested to see whether or not, like at the conference that you went to or the workshop you went to, whether or not there was WHO officials there and what role that they played, kind of jumping off of the box question.
If I'm not mistaken, I think this specific group is the international organization, which is part of BBMRI-ERIC, I hope, but I would need to double check that. But they are not visible much in the community, to be honest. I would say in the conference, most visible is really BBMRI-ERIC as the entity. And then there are like many topics which are being discussed, mostly legal, ethical. It's all about informed consent. It's all about translating GDPR to the biobanking practice, talk about IT measures and so forth. The international regulation or the international context is not really brought there. It's not really brought there, to be honest.
So maybe another two-finger sort of adjacent question might be, so the European Commission is funding BBM.
Exactly.
So what's their imagined future, right? I don't know if you've looked into that.
Yeah. It's really the future of public health and medicine. The precision medicine is the key. Like how the idea is, the researchers say that the current medical care is greatly ineffective because it is not targeted to the individual. And there are like a large percent of people who do not get the right care, so to speak. And that's why the precision medicine should really bridge this gap and come up with more specific measures, medical measures to individuals. But how this will look like in practice and how this will be funded, this is also a big thing, a big question. That's something that is not really clear yet.
Shinru?
My name is Shinru, a postdoc here at CSAC, and thank you so much first for the presentation. I feel like you identified a very important blind spot in the security studies that nobody are actually paying attention to. It has like great implications in the future. So, and the findings are super counterintuitive, which I really like. So my question is kind of like a two-step question. It's about interstate competition in the biobanking and as well as the biobanking in interstate conflicts. So based on what you said, like, security as a firewall, security as privacy, security, a state biobanking relationship, it's most about the concerns between private actors and the public participants and the state and its domestic public in terms of policing and this kind of things. So I'm wondering, based on your research, have you ever, can you talk a little bit more about how different states like China, EU, US, they approach this kind of biobanking? What are the similarities or difference in their approaches? Are there collaborations, this kind of issue? And also, reversely, how the biobanking can you envision cause problems in the interstate, like competition, conflicts? Because I understand you mentioned that the narratives do not exist yet from the perspective of the national interest, but because you research on this, what kind of problem can you envision, arise in this sense? Thank you.
Super interesting, super interesting dimension. Thank you for that. As you rightly said, the international competition and conflict part is not really part of the discourse on biobanking so far. It's difficult to say something on that. Also, I have studied the European context. I do not know much about the US or Chinese, even though in both countries biobanks are relatively on rise. The one example I mentioned, but China is also very much interested in biobanking, which in the context of the undemocratic state and the other policies that China has, this could really be, I would say, very potentially problematic way of using data. But what I can say, for instance, is that there are among biobankers concerns nowadays regarding the transfer of data to non-European countries. I recall one session from the Europe Biobank Week when I felt almost as if I were at the airport, because they always talk about the European and non-European transfers of data and what are the different challenges to that. So there are more regulatory challenges if you want to, let's say, share data with the US Biobank, with US researchers. But it's mostly discussed at the technical and legal level. So how to do this, how to make this possible. It's more like another obstacle, but not something that would really block the interstate research cooperation. I think there is a big promise of sharing data. This is what the BBMRI-ERIC seeks to promote. That really biobanks share data, and the bigger the better logic, so to speak. So the interstate sharing is very much supported, and it's not really politicized or seen as a political concern in terms of which country do you share it with.
Megan Palmer.
Yeah, thank you very much for Megan Palmer. I'm a senior research scholar here at CSAC. Thanks very much for this presentation on a pretty interesting topic, and I really appreciated your conceptualization of the different framings on security here. I would say that the politicization of biobanking and the security concerns, that landscape is changing really quickly. I realize I have overexposure to certain communities, but the questions of the value of certain data sets is being hotly debated at this moment, certainly in the US. And the value it very much is debated, but there are considerations for not exporting data. So especially in China, limiting any export of genomic data. And those same types of policies being considered here and other places. And so I think that your framing could be really useful to begin to explore what are the types of arguments being made for security as these start to roll out. And you can see some of them in the US within the White House request for information on the bioeconomy. The language is often changing here, but that could be also a subject for this as you go forward. I think there's a really interesting opportunity to look at what are the imaginaries around the value, the threats that are emerging as these begin to be more political objects. So thanks.
Super interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for these questions and the comments, and also thanks to Megan for the previous comment. I think the comparison with the US context would be incredibly interesting. And as I said, I have focused on the European context, but I believe that the US and Chinese really deserve more attention, that is for sure. And in Europe, I really feel that this is very much like an expert bureaucratic debate, right? Which lacks all these levels that you talk about, including the, let's say, geopolitical one and the temporal one, the historical parallels, if we can call it parallels, and the overall broader social and political context, which I find incredibly interesting. And at the same time, when I look at the biobanking community as such, you really see and feel genuine interest in making biobanking right. They don't want to ignore the context. They want to make things right. That's why they put a lot of emphasis, they place a lot of emphasis on all these measures, on all these little practices of socially engaged research. I would say this is very much an example of the responsible science as we know it these days. So how to engage patients, how to talk with them, how to explain to them what is happening with their data. So there's a lot of like good science going on, but I would argue in a very small context without all these dimensions that you very rightly identified. And I really feel the need to bring these dimensions in. I think this is very much needed, but at the same time, how to make it in a constructive way, because when biobanks share their data with some researchers, of course they have a look at what type of research it is going to be, right? And at least in Europe, under the GDPR and all the other regulations, they do not give it just to anyone, and they are pretty well aware that the research should have some ethical standards, and there should be some also that the research group or organization should have some established name and so forth. So I would say a lot is being done already, even without conceptualizing the bigger threats that might be there. But it's really surprising that the whole temporal and historical dimension is missing from the discourse. That is true. How to put it, how to bring it to the conversation, I don't know. That's what I'm asking.
Even though the exact things you raise about sort of ethical dimensions are all based on historical narratives and research and examples that led to the creation of, like, the history's there. It's just, in a sense, also buried in the way people talk about it.
Might be.
So I have a two-finger from Melissa Griffith, and then I have Melissa Carlson still, and I added myself to the list as well. So I think.
Yes, I think building off this point about where they're pulling these frames from, whether there's sort of a historical look back toward a history of biodata and the way that that's been used, versus just leveraging the bureaucratic community they're in already. So when you mentioned the two frames that are the most common, those were unsurprising to me as a cybersecurity person, right? That it would be heavily IT, the integrity, the reliability, and access to data, one of the most mature areas in the EU of thinking about security, or the other would be privacy, GDPR, one of the most mature areas in the EU of thinking about security. Right, so it seems like you could pick not just a biodata community or a biobank community, any, like I do cybersecurity ethnographies, and those are the two most common there as well, right, within the EU. And so I think there's this interesting kind of like, where do they port in these understandings? Because I think they are deeply embedded in these communities. They're not necessarily looking backward, they're just looking at the infrastructure they're embedded within. And so I think like the next step, thinking about branching out to some of these other countries, would they be importing different frames into those same conversations? Because I think that's a really useful heuristic, because those two are hands down the most mature in the EU context by far, in terms of just conceptual all the way down to operationalizing legislation, regulation, technical realities, straight down to the member state, local community level. Those two would just stand out.
If you want to comment on any of these that are more comments rather than questions, I'm happy. You should jump in. But I think I had Melissa Carlson next.
So I'm Melissa. I'm a pre-doctoral fellow here at CSAC. So this is absolutely fascinating, and I just want to echo what everyone has said about this being a super important but overlooked research project. So I had a question more about the physical security of the actual samples that are being stored in the biobanks, because it seems to me that the community is really concerned about, you know, the digital security like we've been talking about. But in my Google search, I also saw that one of the largest biobanks is in Qatar. And so my question is anyone concerned about this type of physical data being stored in, like the physical samples being stored in places that might potentially be hit by conflict? And are there any regulations kind of sprouting up around that? And one of the things that I thought of, and this is more of a comment, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, or if you've heard anything about it. I'm guessing that infectious diseases are stored within some of these banks. And so I can imagine that, like infectious disease, like smallpox or something, but I'm not sure if that's true or not, because I don't know anything about biobanks. But if they are, then I'm wondering whether or not, if these banks are popping up in potential conflict zones or real conflict zones, then, or are struck by conflict, then how might non-state actors like terrorist organizations use them for biological weapons? Is this something that's even been thought about, or is this kind of been left off to the wayside?
Thank you. Super interesting question. Actually, there is very little attention paid to the physical samples, and some people even argue that we don't need the physical samples anymore because we sequence everything anyway from the new samples. So why to keep them? And here again, the anticipatory governance comes in, and others would argue, well, what if we come up for some different purpose for the physical samples? So let's keep them just in case we find some new use for them in the future. So they are there. It's very expensive to keep them in these big freezers and so forth. But the physical security, or the security of the physical samples, it's not so much of an issue as far as I know. In the European context, this mostly concerns, let's say, the security from natural disasters, so that it doesn't get destroyed by floods or something like that. How this is done in other areas, again, I'm sorry, but I do not know. An important thing here to say is probably that biobanks do not collect diseases, such the infectious diseases. As you mentioned, this would be a very different area, more like the biodefense programs, and this is not very, as far as I know, associated with biobanks. These are really like separate facilities and separate type of research.
Thank you. So I had a couple questions, but if other people want to get on the list, please raise your hand. They're not exactly related, but one, I noticed you emphasized trust and maintenance of trust being super important for the biobank story. And I know that certainly in the area of cybersecurity, I've recently learned apparently what's an old saying is that there's companies that have been breached and companies that know they've been breached, right? And so to what extent are biobanks set up to know that they have been subject to not attack, but exploit, people accessing their systems to retrieve information? And are there any frameworks for encouraging biobanks to reveal sort of ways in which they've been attacked or threatened, share that data? Because I know that's a huge issue in the United States where companies fear to do this because it might undermine customer trust in their services, and because it might expose them to liability, right, and legal action. So that's one set of questions, and to what extent, is this trust issue in a sense of vulnerability for biobanks, and that they plan to address. And the second thing that it reminded me a little bit about, because a lot of your story is, and people don't pay attention to this, very important thing. And so it reminded me of some of the work of on sort of the politics of expertise. And we were just talking about one of your, another sort of person in the Science Technology Society field in Vienna, and sort of, in a sense, is this something that's been, as Anna Weichselbraun said, been made boring, deliberately boring so that politicians ignore it, right? And pay attention to other things as a self-defense mechanism in a certain sense, might be a way of framing it. So is there a politics of expertise that's, in this? And related to that, I'm sorry I'm asking so many questions, but we have a few minutes, is it strikes me that that politics might be quite different in Europe and in the United States. So the thought that this is a public trust and public good, and that reassures Europeans, would be viewed quite negatively in the United States, where people are concerned about government having access to this kind of data, or any individualized data, but are perfectly happy to have private companies track everything, measure everything, learn everything about us. I think at a talk a couple years ago, Susan Athey, who's a professor at the business school, actually they did research to find out how much you have to pay somebody in the United States to give away their data. It's about the price of a slice of pizza, is what she estimated. So, which we're constantly doing because we use free quote unquote apps constantly. So anyway, a bunch of related questions there, if you could address some or all of them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Very, very interesting. I will come to the first. How are biobanks open about the vulnerabilities and breaches which they know that have happened? As I said, there have been very few incidents, and this is mostly, as far as I know, related to biobanks being part of, let's say, hospital, and the hospital might have become subject to, let's say, some cyber attack or blackmail. Typically, there have not been any like serious security incidents in the sphere. Typically, it's like some hacker blocking the data, and then the actor has to pay money for getting the access back. But from what I understood from the community in Europe, the biobanking community is really relatively small and very very friendly. Everyone knows everyone, and they really do share information. It really is a community from what I have seen. So I think the culture of openness about these type of things is there for sure. So I wouldn't be much concerned about that. Again, I don't know the context in other countries, but in Europe, I don't really see that this is something that they would want to hide. They really want to share the best practices because it is in the realm of what they talk about already, right? This is the data security, the technical part of story, and this is something they try to work on as much as possible. So I see no problem with that. Regarding the government versus private sphere, I think this is really like a massive difference between Europe and US in terms of the trust in the government. But also you can see differences within Europe because let's say I would say there is a strong correlation from what I have heard from the biobanking community in terms of the level of trust in biobanks. So people, this would be my hypothesis, people from countries where there is bigger trust in government tend to also trust biobanks more. So if there is a strong support of the state, then the biobanks are also seen unproblematically. Conversely, in states where the government is seen as a problem, as failing the people, the biobanks also typically struggle to get patients, to get people to participate in the biobanks because people don't really see this as that the state would take proper care of the data and the samples.
Great.
Well, we need to do research on that. Yeah. I'm already speculating based on very limited data that I have. But I think the interesting specificity of biobank is that there is, on the one hand, slight chance that you might get some individual benefit in return if there is an incidental finding that you are reported on. But biobanks mostly present themselves as really serving public value. So you give your data not because you would then gain direct benefit, but for the future of research. So is future research part of the public health care system, or is it more associated with the government, trust in government?
I think that would be, it could be an interesting question.
Yeah. Yeah, there are so many elements in the play field, and I think this really needs more unpacking. But this is super interesting question. So trust in what is the public, what aspect of government? Yeah.
Great. So I think we've reached the end of our questions. And please join me in thanking Dagmar for her talk.